The morning my name appeared on that Forbes list, I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat very still. And I thought about a 14-year-old girl sitting in the corner of a room, not crying quietly, crying the way your whole body shakes because you are exhausted. Exhausted from fighting. Exhausted from trying. Exhausted from being invisible in a world that only knew how to measure intelligence through a pencil. And that girl was asking herself one question. Just one. How am I going to survive in a world that has already decided what I am? That girl was me, Amelia, 14 years old, and already concluded upon. My parents had already decided. Not loudly, not in one conversation, just slowly. The way a verdict gets reached before anyone enters the room. By the time I was 10 years old, it was done. My brother was the smart one, the future, the one worth investing in. And I was the problem they were relieved to hand off. The one with the learning disability. The one they looked at and saw a ceiling instead of a road. They gave him the family company. Everything they had spent decades building. Their blood. Their savings. Their name. Their legacy. They handed it to him without hesitation. Without once asking whether he had earned it. And within a few years, he destroyed it. Every last piece. I found out later, through a cousin who was there, exactly what happened in my parents' house the morning my mother saw my name on that list. She was scrolling through her phone, the way she did every morning. And she stopped. She read the name twice. Then, without saying a single word, she held the screen up to my father. My cousin said the silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And then my mother sat down. And she cried. Not the way I cried at 14. She cried the way people cry when they realize, too late and too clearly, exactly what they failed to do. But before I get to that morning, before I get to Forbes, and the company, and the phone call from my father where his voice was smaller, somehow. Like a man standing on ground that had just given way beneath him. Before all of that, I need to take you back. All the way back. To a house where a little girl with dysgraphia was being quietly, deliberately, concluded upon. If you're here for stories of justice for people who were written off, labeled, dismissed, handed off like a burden, and rose anyway, subscribe. Stay. New stories like this one every single week. Now, let me take you back to where this one started. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. I want to tell you something about the kind of child I was. Before the labels. Before the diagnoses. Before anyone had decided anything about me. I was a child who loved ideas. Big ones. Not the small, tidy kind that fit neatly into a sentence. The big, sprawling, impossible kind, the kind that filled the whole room when you talked about them. I could talk for hours about anything. About the way clouds moved, about why people made the choices they made, about what I thought the future would look like. And people listened. The real kind. The leaning forward kind. The wait, say that part again kind. At 7 years old, I could hold a room. That should have told someone something. It didn't. When I was young, maybe 6, maybe 7, they sat me down and gave it a name. Dysgraphia. It's not the one they talk about in movies. It's not the one that gets the awareness campaigns and the colored ribbons. Dysgraphia means that the path between your brain and your hand is built differently. Not broken. Differently. My brain worked. God, my brain worked. It worked overtime. It worked in color. It worked in all directions simultaneously. My ideas were crystal clear. But the moment I had to write them down, they disappeared. Like trying to hold water in a fist. You can feel it. You can feel that it's there. And then you open your hand. And it's gone. A pencil felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my hand. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. It is not an exaggeration. One sentence took everything I had. Every bit of focus. Every bit of concentration. While my classmates were moving on to the next paragraph, I was still fighting through the first line. While my brother finished his homework in 20 minutes, I was still sitting at that table an hour later. And in a world that measures intelligence through a pencil, through how fast you can write, how neatly you can write, I was invisible. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the world had decided that what I couldn't do was more important than everything I could. My brother was 2 years older than me. 2 years. In most families, just a number. In our family, 2 years felt like a different planet. He had perfect grades. The kind that got shown to relatives at family gatherings like a trophy. Perfect handwriting. The kind teachers held up as an example to the class. My parents looked at him the way you are supposed to look at your children. With hope. With vision. With a kind of belief that says, I see who you are going to become. They looked at me differently. I don't say that with bitterness. Not anymore. I say it because it is simply, plainly, undeniably true. And a child always knows. A child always knows. I remember one afternoon. I must have been 7. Maybe 8. The age when you are small enough that adults forget you are in the room. I was sitting on the floor of the hallway. And my father was on the phone nearby. He was talking about the company. He was talking about who would take it over one day. And he laughed, the easy, certain laugh of a man who has already made up his mind. And he said a name. It wasn't mine. I remember sitting very still on that floor. Something in me understood enough. Something in me registered. That in the story my father was telling about the future. I wasn't in it. What time is it where you are, and what state or country are you watching from? Tell me below. I grew up in a house that was full. Full of noise, full of food, full of family coming and going. From the outside, it probably looked like a happy home. And in many ways, it was. But underneath all of that, there was a current. My brother moved through that house like someone who owned it. Comfortable. Certain. Unhurried. And I moved through it like someone who was still trying to figure out whether she was welcome in it. I was. Technically. But there is a difference, a very real, very felt difference, between being in a house and belonging in it. My parents were not monsters. They were not cruel people in the way that word usually gets used. It was quieter than that. More insidious than that. The slow accumulation of 1,000 small choices, 1,000 small moments where one child was seen and one child was not. That built, over years, into something as permanent as a wall. My brother was their vision of success. And I was their reminder that things don't always go to plan. I felt it. Every single day. I felt it. But here is what I need you to understand. Before I take you into what school looked like, I need you to understand that up until this point, I had not broken. I was bent. I was carrying more than any child should carry. But I had not broken. That came later. And what I'm about to tell you, this is the part one have never fully said out loud. Stay with me. Because you need to hear it. And honestly, I think I've needed to say it for a very long time. School. The version where you walk through those doors every single morning knowing that the next several hours will require you to do the one thing that costs you more than it costs anyone else in the room. Right. Take what is in your head, the ideas, the answers, the understanding that is genuinely there, and transfer it to a page. Through a pencil. In a timed test. In front of everyone. That was my school. Every day. 4 years. We were 2 years apart in school. But the gap felt like a chasm. Every single day, I walked into a building where my brother's name existed 2 levels above mine. Where his classroom was, literally, physically, considered more advanced than mine. And the teachers knew it. Harm doesn't need to be malicious to be real. You can wound a child completely by accident, casually, offhandedly, in the middle of a regular Tuesday. And that wound can carry for decades. The comparisons started early. Regularly. Casually. Like it was just a fact of nature.
Why can't you be more like your brother? He's so smart. You are struggling.
Struggling. That word. I heard it so many times that it stopped sounding like a description. It stopped being something someone said about me. And it started being me. Amelia. The struggling one. Not the girl with the ideas. Not the girl who could hold a room. The struggling one. And the terrifying thing about a label, the thing nobody warns you about, is how quickly you start to believe it. How quickly it moves from something someone said about you to something you say about yourself. In the dark. At night. When nobody is listening. I believed it. I hate that I believed it. But I did. My handwriting was slow. And messy. From the outside, it probably just looked like carelessness. Like I wasn't trying hard enough. The truth was the opposite. I was trying harder than almost anyone in that room. And children. Children are honest in the worst possible way. They laughed. At my speed. At my letters. They laughed the way children laugh when they don't yet understand that their laughter is a weapon. And my brother was in that building. He knew what those letters cost me. He had sat at the same dinner table. He had watched me at homework night after night. He knew. He laughed too. I remember the exact moment. I had looked up from my desk, the way you do when you feel eyes on you. And I found his face. In the crowd. And he was laughing. Not nervously. Not with guilt. Just laughing. Easy. Relaxed. Like it was funny. Like I was funny. The boy who shared my parents. The boy who shared my home. Who absolutely knew what it cost me just to hold a pencil. Laughing. I didn't cry. Not then. I just looked at him. And I looked back down at my page. And I kept writing. Because what else was I supposed to do? Before I go any further, if this is the kind of story you came here for, the kind where someone was written off and decided that wasn't the end of the sentence, hit subscribe. New stories like this one every single week. I'm not going anywhere. Now let me keep going. Here is the thing about how my parents responded to having two children, one who excelled on paper and one who struggled with paper itself. They invested in what they understood. My brother's potential was visible. It showed up on report cards. It showed up in the easy, confident way he moved through a world built for exactly the kind of mind he had. My disability was also visible. But they didn't understand what they were looking at. They didn't understand that dysgraphia is not a cap on intelligence. That it is not a verdict. They understood it as a ceiling. A permanent one. And when the people who are supposed to be your first believers decide that your limitation is your ceiling, it takes everything you have not to believe them. Everything. And some days, I didn't have everything. Some days I had nothing left. And I believed them anyway. If you've ever been the one in your family who was consistently overlooked, type I see you in the comments. I want to pause here, because I know someone watching this right now knows exactly what I'm describing. Not as a story they've heard, as a life they've lived. The dinner table where one child's achievements take up all the oxygen in the room. The report card that gets shown to relatives and the one that quietly disappears. The investment that flows in one direction so consistently, so automatically, that it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like gravity. If that is you, if you are watching this right now and you are recognizing yourself in this story, I see you. I genuinely, completely see you. And I need you to stay with me. Because this story does not end where it started. It does not end where they decided it would end. It ends somewhere else entirely. Keep watching. The years move the way difficult years move. Slowly when you're inside them, and then all at once when you look back. Each year brought new classrooms, new teachers, new opportunities for the same comparisons to be made in new ways. And each year, the gap between how my brother was seen and how I was seen widened a little more. Not because I was getting worse. I wasn't getting worse. If anything, I was getting stronger, getting more determined, finding ways to compensate that no one around me ever bothered to notice or acknowledge. But the story had already been written. By teachers who compared. By classmates who laughed. By a brother who chose the crowd. By parents who looked at a detour and called it a dead end. The story had been written. And nobody asked me if I had anything to add to it. By the time I was in secondary school, something had shifted. The verdict had already been reached. Not in one conversation, not with one cruel declaration, but in the accumulation of small agreements, small assumptions, made so consistently over so many years that by the time anyone looked up, the decision had already been made. My brother would inherit the company. That was settled. Spoken about with the casual certainty of something that was simply going to happen. And me? They didn't really think about my future at all. My brother's future was a conversation that happened regularly, enthusiastically. My future was a silence. A comfortable silence. And I grew up inside that silence. Year after year. Inside the silence where my future should have been. I knew. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it. Not because anyone was honest enough to say it to my face. But because of what they didn't say. And sometimes, what people don't say is the loudest thing in the room. They never asked what I wanted to be. Never. Not once. They never researched schools for me the way they researched schools for him. They never sat down and said, "Amelia, what do you see for yourself?" Never. I was 14 years old. 14. And I had already been concluded upon. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. With something worse. With indifference. Because cruelty at least requires that someone is paying attention to you. Indifference means they've stopped looking altogether. And I had started to wonder whether that meant there was nothing worth seeing. I want to tell you about one specific evening. It was an ordinary dinner. No occasion. Just the four of us. My brother had brought home a test. A 93. My parents lit up. There is no other way to describe it. My father put his hand on my brother's shoulder. Firm. Proud. My mother smiled. Her specific smile. The one she had for him. The room was warm with it. And then, I had brought home a test that same week. I need you to understand what that test cost me. Hours. At that sparse desk. Under that single lamp. Going over the material again and again, not because I was slow, but because I had learned that I needed to know things more completely to compensate for what the test format would take away from me. I studied harder for that test than I had studied for anything in my entire life. I got a 68. I put it on the table. They looked at it. My father picked it up. Held it for a moment. Put it down. My mother glanced at it. And said nothing. Nothing. "No, we know you worked hard. No, we see the effort." Nothing. They just put it down. And went back to the conversation about his 93. 68. When you have dysgraphia, when written tests are not just a measure of what you know but an obstacle course between what you know and what you can prove, a 68 can cost you everything you have. A 68, for me, was not a failure. A 68, for me, was survival. And what I wanted, what I needed, in that quiet room at that ordinary table, was for someone to know that. 3 words. Just 3 words that would have told me I was not invisible. They just put it down and went back. Back to the 93. Back to the smile. Back to the hand on the shoulder. I finished my dinner. I cleared my plate. I went back to my room. And I sat at that desk under that lamp for a long time. Not studying. Not doing anything. Just sitting. In the silence where someone's voice should have been. I want to pause here. Because I have told parts of this story before. In pieces. In private. And every single time, the part that lands hardest for the people listening is not the big moments. It's not the dramatic confrontations. It's not the loud declarations. It's the ordinary moments. The test put down without a word. The dinner table where one child is seen and one child isn't. The silence that sits in the space where a parent's belief should have been. Those quiet moments. Those are the ones that stay. Those are the ones that follow you from that dinner table into every room you enter for the rest of your life. Into every job interview where you wonder if you're good enough. Into every relationship where you wait to be found out. Into every success that you almost can't receive because some part of you is still sitting at that table waiting for someone to put it down. If you know what I'm talking about, drop a 1 in the comments. Because you should know you are not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. Now, Let me keep going. Because the hardest part of this story is still coming. The pattern continued. Week after week. Month after month. The comparisons at school never stopped. The investment at home never shifted. The conversations about the future kept happening around me without ever including me. And I kept showing up. I want you to understand that. I kept showing up. To school. To that table. To that house. To that family. Even as it became clearer and clearer that showing up was not going to change anything. That no amount of effort, no amount of trying, no amount of quietly, stubbornly refusing to disappear was going to make them look. I kept showing up. Because I was a child. And children keep showing up for the people they love long after those people have given them reason not to. Long after any reasonable adult would have walked away. That is not weakness. I want to say that clearly for anyone who needs to hear it. That is not weakness. That is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go. And then came the afternoon. The one that broke me. Not bent me further. Not added another layer. Broke me. I was 14 years old. And it was an ordinary afternoon. But that is how these things work, isn't it? It is never the biggest thing. It is always the ordinary afternoon. The unremarkable Tuesday. The moment that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. And is, from the inside, everything. I have never fully described that afternoon to anyone. Until now. Stay with me. I came home from school. Ordinary day. Nothing specific happened. I walked through the front door. Put my bag down. Walked to my room. And something inside me just collapsed. Not a decision. Not a choice I made. Just a collapse. I cried. Not quietly. Deeply. The kind of crying where your whole body shakes. Because you are exhausted. Exhausted from fighting. Exhausted from trying. Exhausted from showing up every single day to a world that had already decided what you were. Exhausted from being invisible in a world that only knew how to measure intelligence through a pencil. A pencil. That was all it took to make everything I was count for nothing. I sat in the corner of that room. Not at the desk. Not on the bed. The corner. The place you go when you need something solid at your back. And I thought one thought. Just one. How am I going to survive in a world that has already decided what I am? I was 14 years old. And that was the question I was sitting with on the floor of my bedroom on an ordinary afternoon in a house full of people who did not know I was breaking. Because nobody came to check. Nobody knocked. I was invisible even in my own collapse. And then, something happened that I did not expect. Something that I have thought about almost every day of my life since. A man walked past my door. And stopped. My uncle saw me that day. Uncle Mike. He was my father's brother. He wasn't a daily presence in that house. He was just passing through. That day. On that ordinary afternoon. Walking past a door that happened to be slightly open. And he could have kept walking. I want you to understand that. He was not required to stop. But he walked past that room. And he stopped. He looked at me like I was a person worth stopping for. Do you understand what it means, at 14 years old, after years of being looked past, looked over, looked through? To have someone stop. Just stop. And look at you like you matter. He didn't have the words yet. But he stopped. And that was everything. He went to my parents and asked, quietly, directly, if he could train me, mentor me, help me find my footing. He just said, let me work with her. Let me see what she has. They said yes. And here is the thing. They said yes without hesitation. Not a pause. And I have thought about that for years. The speed of that yes. Because a yes that fast is not a yes that comes from a place of trust. It is a yes that comes from a place of, finally, someone else is taking this. The problem we didn't know how to solve, the child we didn't know how to see, the future we hadn't bothered to imagine, is now someone else's responsibility. That lack of hesitation, that immediate, undisguised relief, told me everything about how little they had been carrying me at all. My uncle took my hand and walked me forward, out of that corner, out of that room, out of the version of my story that everyone around me had already decided was finished. None of us knew yet what he was actually giving me. We just knew that something had shifted, that the afternoon that had started with a collapse in the corner of a room was ending differently than it had begun. The universe knew before any of us did. It always does. I need you to keep watching. Because what happens next? What Uncle Mike saw in me before I could see it in myself, what he built, what he said, I genuinely had to sit with before I could say it out loud. Not because it is painful, but because it is the part of the story that means the most to me. And some things you have to be ready to say properly. Stay with me. Uncle Mike was the first person to ever truly see me. Not my disability. Not the diagnosis. Not the label. Not my limitations. Not the problem I represented. Me. He saw me. The actual me. The one underneath all of it, underneath the diagnosis and the poor grades and the slow handwriting and the years of being concluded upon. The me that had been there the entire time. Uncle Mike looked. And he found her. And I will never, for as long as I live, stop being grateful for that. He noticed things that no one else had bothered to look for. And I want to be specific about that, because I think specificity matters here. I don't mean he was generally encouraging. I mean he observed. Carefully. Quietly. Over time. The way a person observes when they are genuinely trying to understand what they are looking at. Not to confirm what they already think, but to discover what is actually there. He noticed I was exceptional at engaging people. In conversation. In rooms. He noticed that when I talked, really talked, without the barrier of a pencil, people leaned forward. He noticed that in oral assessments, when I didn't have to write, when what mattered was what I actually knew, I was unstoppable. That is not my word. That is the word people used when they experienced it. Unstoppable. Because when the obstacle was removed, there was nothing to hold me back. There never had been. He noticed I had an intuitive feel for technology that was almost instinctive. Not learned. Not studied. Instinctive. The kind of relationship with technology that some people are simply born with. And he noticed something else. He noticed that I had a resilience. A particular, specific, hard-won resilience. That my brother, with all his advantages, with all the ease poured into him since birth, would never be forced to develop. Because here is the truth about ease. Ease does not build the muscle. Struggle builds the muscle. Having nothing handed to you, having to fight for every inch, having to find the side door every time the front door is locked, having to build your own tools because no one gave you theirs. That teaches you something that cannot be taught any other way. Uncle Mike saw that in me. He saw the muscle that years of struggle had built. And he knew exactly what to do with it. He gave me a laptop. I know that might sound simple. A laptop. But do you understand what typing is compared to writing by hand when you have dysgraphia? Writing by hand, for me, was like trying to speak through a wall. I knew what I wanted to say. Completely. Clearly. But between the knowing and the saying, there was this wall. This thick, exhausting wall that absorbed most of what I was trying to communicate. Typing was a door. Suddenly there was a door in the wall. And every mistake, every single mistake, had a backspace key. Do you know what it means to have a backspace key when you have spent your entire life in a world that does not offer backspace? Where every mistake is permanent. Where every wrong letter sits on the page as evidence of everything they already believed about you. The backspace key was not just a function. It was a philosophy. It said, nothing is permanent. You can fix it. You can try again. That laptop, that single tool in the hands of one person who understood what I needed, changed everything. Not because it made me smarter. I was already smart. Because it removed the wall between what I knew and what I could prove. And then he got me into Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, the school my parents, who had looked at my dysgraphia and seen a ceiling, had never once imagined me attending. Not once. And I went. And I did not merely survive it. But I will get to that. More than the laptop. More than Caltech. More than any material thing. Uncle Mike gave me words. Because the right words, at the right moment, from the right person, do not just make you feel better. They rebuild the architecture of how you see yourself. And mine had been damaged for a very long time.
Look at you. Look how far you've come. I'm proud of you. You're a survivor.
He made me promise to say those exact words to myself. Every single day. Morning and night. Like a practice. Like a discipline. I did not always believe the words when I said them. There were mornings when I stood in front of a mirror and said them. And some part of me was still 14 years old sitting in that corner asking how she was going to survive. Still hearing the words struggling echo from classrooms that no longer existed. But I said them anyway. Because Uncle Mike had looked directly at me and said,
You don't need people's approval to be great in life. Your learning disability only means you need to put in more effort at schoolwork. You were never disadvantaged. You also belong in those high rooms.
You also belong in those high rooms. I have carried that sentence in my body for over a decade. Not in my mind. In my body. The way certain things settle into you not as thoughts but as something more physical, something in your chest, something in your spine, something that straightens you when you are about to fold. You also belong in those high rooms. Not, maybe you belong. Not, one day you might belong. Present tense. Already. As you are. With the disability. With the slow handwriting. With the years of being concluded upon. You also belong. For the first time in my life, someone had seen past the label to what was actually on the other side. Someone saw me, the real me, and said, "You belong here." I did not know it yet, but that sentence was the foundation of everything I was about to build. I graduated from Caltech at the top of my class. In all of the institution, I built a company from nothing, no family capital, no inheritance, no safety net. Just the skills Uncle Mike had seen in me before I could see them in myself. And life continued. Quietly. Steadily. But then, I found something. Something I was never supposed to find. Something that changed not just my future, but the future of every single person in that family that had concluded upon me. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. Stay with me. Caltech. I want you to sit with that name for a moment. One of the most rigorous, most demanding, most intellectually unforgiving academic institutions in the United States. A place built for the exceptional. For the ones who think differently. The school my parents never once imagined me attending. My brother's future had been mapped out with investment and vision. My future had been a silence. And Caltech was not part of any silence. I attended. I want to say that simply. Without decoration. I attended. The girl with dysgraphia. The struggling one. The one they had handed off without hesitation. I attended. And I did not merely survive it. It was hard. I will not pretend otherwise. There were nights that stretched toward morning without mercy, where I sat with that laptop and fought for every idea. There were moments of doubt so heavy I could barely get out of my chair. The voice that had been built in me over years of classrooms and dinner tables. The voice that said you are not enough, you do not belong here, was louder than everything else. But here is what those years of struggle had given me that ease could never have provided. I knew how to keep going when keeping going felt impossible. I had been practicing that my entire life. I graduated at the top of my class. In all of the institution. Not in my department. In all of the institution. And when I walked across that stage, I thought about the corner of a room and the question I had asked at 14. I thought about the teacher who had said, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I thought about a test with a 68 being put down without a word. And I thought about Uncle Mike. Standing somewhere in that audience. Watching. The only person in that building who had known, before any of this, that I belonged there. That I had always belonged there. I graduated at the top of my class. And I carried every person who had ever doubted me across that stage with me. Not as a burden. As evidence. Not despite my dysgraphia. I want to be very clear about that. Because the easy version of this story is the version where I succeeded in spite of the thing that held me back. Despite the disability. Despite the years. Despite everything they said about me. That is a clean story. But it is not the true one. The true one is this. I succeeded because of what my dysgraphia had forced me to become. Because of what years of grinding had built in me that ease never could have. Because of what failing, genuinely, repeatedly, visibly failing, in a world that was watching and forming conclusions, had taught me about resilience. About finding the side door when the front door is locked. About building your own tools when no one gives you theirs. About knowing, deeply, in your body and not just your mind, that you can survive what feels unsurvivable. Because I had already survived it. Before Caltech. Before the laptop. Before Uncle Mike stopped in that doorway. I had been surviving it my entire life. Every day. Every classroom. Every dinner table. Every silence. My dysgraphia taught me that the front door is not the only way in. My dysgraphia taught me that the backspace key exists. That nothing is permanent, that mistakes are not verdicts, that you can try again as many times as it takes. My dysgraphia taught me that the people who told me I had a ceiling were simply people who had never bothered to look for the door. My brother graduated too. He worked. He studied. Perfect grades. Perfect credentials. Perfect future. Arranged for him. My parents gave him the company. And I need you to understand the basis on which they gave it. Not because he had earned it. He had not demonstrated, in any concrete, observable way, that he had the vision, the hunger, the genuine desire to build something rather than simply inhabit something that already existed. Not because he had vision. Not because he had sat down with my parents and laid out a plan for where he would take it. But because he was the son. The smart one. The one without the disability. The one they had always planned it for. Not because of who he was, but because of who they had decided he was before he had the chance to prove it either way. He took it the way he had taken everything in his life. With entitlement. Without accountability. Without the muscle that struggle builds. The muscle I had been building my entire life. He didn't care about building it. He cared about what it gave him. The status. The identity of being the person in charge. Without any genuine interest in what being in charge actually required. And he ran it into the ground. I say that without satisfaction. There is no pleasure in watching something your parents built with decades of their lives deteriorate. There is only the quiet, terrible sadness of watching something real be destroyed by someone who never understood what it was worth. He ran it into the ground. And my parents, who had given everything to the wrong child, watched it happen. If you've ever walked away from someone who refused to see your value, comment boundaries. Say it loud. I was not watching from a place of distance. Part of me grieved it. The part of me that was still the child who had grown up in that house. Who had loved those parents even when that love had nowhere to go. And part of me, a smaller part, a part one I'm not proud of but will not pretend doesn't exist. Understood. Understood, in the way that only someone who was never given a chance can understand, what it means to watch the world arrange itself into something true. But at this point in the story, none of what was coming had happened yet. I was building. Quietly. Steadily. In silence. The way things get built when no one is watching. Which is to say, the way the most important things always get built. I had started my own company. From nothing. No family capital. No inheritance. No safety net. No name handed to me with the assumption that having it meant I had earned it. Just the skills Uncle Mike had seen in me before I could see them in myself. The ability to engage people. The intuition for technology. The resilience of someone who had been told she had nothing and built something anyway. By the time I was 28, my company had crossed into territory I had once only read about. The kind of territory that gets noticed. The kind of territory that puts your name on lists. One morning, before I had even made coffee, my phone began buzzing. Not once. Buzzing. Repeatedly. Insistently. Messages from colleagues. from old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. I picked it up. There was something quieter first. The particular caution of someone who has learned not to celebrate until they have confirmed that what they think is happening is actually happening. I opened the Forbes 30 under 30 list. And I scrolled. And there was my name. Amelia. Just my name on that list. Among the most successful young entrepreneurs in the world. The useless one. That is what I thought. Not, I did it. Not, look at me now. I thought. The useless one. Amelia. The useless one. Is on this list. And then I put the phone down. And I sat very still. I was thinking about a 14-year-old girl crying in the corner of a room. Shaking. Asking herself one question. How am I going to survive in a world that has already decided what I am? I wish I could have told her. I wish I could have walked into that room and sat down beside her on the floor and said, Amelia, look at where you are going. Look at what you are going to build. Look at the name they are going to put on that list. But I couldn't. So instead, I sat with it. And I let it be what it was. I found out later, through a cousin who was there, what happened in my parents' house that morning. My mother stopped mid-scroll. She read the name once. Then, she read it again. The first read is recognition. The second read is reckoning. She held the phone up to my father. Without saying a word. My cousin said the silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Then my mother sat down. Slowly. The way people sit down when their legs have decided before their mind has that they can no longer stand. And she cried. Not the way I cried at 14. I cried from exhaustion. From the accumulated weight of years of being invisible. My mother cried from something else entirely. She cried the way people cry when clarity arrives. Sudden, complete, undeniable clarity. About something they should have seen a long time ago. My father didn't cry. He went quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not rest. The kind of quiet that is reckoning. They didn't call me that day. They saw the list. They sat with it. And they did not call. I think they didn't call because they didn't know what to say. They understood, for the first time, that there were no words adequate to the distance between what they had done and what I had become. And they understood something else. That even if they could find the words, they had not yet earned the right to say them. That morning was the morning the power shifted. Quietly. Without announcement. The useless one was no longer what they had concluded. She was something else now. Something they were going to have to find new words for. And the words were coming. By the time I found out my parents had gone bankrupt, I had already known it was coming. It wasn't a shock. I had watched my brother mismanage everything my parents had spent their lives building. And I used that word, mismanage, with full deliberateness. Because it was not bad luck. It was mismanagement. The specific, avoidable consequence of handing something significant to someone who had never been asked to develop the capacity to handle it. The company I grew up hearing about. The one woven into every family conversation since before I could fully understand what a company was. The one that was discussed as though it were a fixed star. Always going to be there. Always going to be his. deteriorating. Quietly at first, then faster and faster. I watched it happen, and I made a decision. Quietly, privately. A decision about what role I was going to play in a story that had excluded me from the beginning. About whether the girl who had been concluded upon was going to stand at the edge of this collapse and watch, or step into it. I bought the majority of the shares. Quietly. Through lawyers. Through proper channels. Through the precise, careful, entirely legal architecture of a business transaction conducted by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Without announcement. Without drama. Just. Quietly. The way I had always built things. Through the side door, without announcement, with complete focus on what I was actually trying to do. I bought the majority of the shares of the company my parents had built. The company that was never meant for me. The company my brother had been handed and had destroyed. And then I waited for the phone to ring. The day my parents found out who had bought the company. My father called me. His voice was different. Smaller somehow. Like a man who has had the floor taken out from under him. Who has just understood, for the first time in one vertiginous moment, how high up he had been standing. And how far there was to fall.
Amelia.
Just my name. In that smaller voice. He was testing. Whether I would still answer to it. Whether the connection he had never fully honored was still there. Still available to him now that he needed it. I said, I know. There was a silence. Long enough for both of us to sit inside it. I had prepared myself for many things. For defensiveness. For justification. I had not prepared for rawness. He said,
I am so sorry. I am so deeply sorry for what we did to you.
My mother got on the phone. She was already crying. I could hear it before she said a word.
We were wrong. We were so wrong about you. We didn't see you. We should have seen you.
We should have seen you. 4 words. 4 words that contained every dinner table, every test put down without a word, every silence where my future should have been. I did not say, it's okay. I want to be clear about that. Because it wasn't okay. And I had spent enough of my life shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. Calling things okay that were not okay. I was not a child anymore. And I was done. What I said was, I know you're sorry. I'm going to need time. And then, I told them what I had decided. I was offering them jobs at the company. Real jobs. With real salaries. With real responsibility. The genuine ability to pay their bills, to rebuild something from what remained. Not out of forgiveness. I was not there yet. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a practice. But out of something more complicated than forgiveness. Call it responsibility. The understanding that even the people who failed you are still human. Call it the recognition that letting them fall completely serves no one. Not them. And not me. Because standing at the edge of someone's ruin and watching does not give you what you are looking for. It just leaves you standing at the edge of someone's ruin. So I offered them jobs. Not from weakness. From power. The specific, quiet, subtle power of someone who has decided what kind of person she is going to be. And then I said the thing I needed them to understand. Clearly. Without softening. I was the CEO. I held the power now. Not my brother. Not the son. Not the smart one. Not the one they had chosen. Me. Amelia. The useless one. The struggling one. The one they had concluded upon. I held the power now. As a fact. A simple, permanent, irrevocable fact that was now the foundation of everything that came next. When my brother found out, he did what entitled people always do when the world stops cooperating with their self-image. He raged. Not with the measured anger of someone who understands they contributed to their own situation. He raged the way people rage when they have never been asked to be accountable. When consequence arrives for the first time and they have no framework for it. He came to my office. I want you to sit with that. He came to my office. And he walked in the way he had always walked into every room his entire life. Like it was his. Like the name on the door was a clerical error. And he said, with complete seriousness, with the full, unironic conviction of someone who believed every word of it.
Why should a woman, Amelia, be the CEO when I'm here?
That line. Drop one word in the comments that describes how that made you feel. I want to give that sentence the space it deserves. Not because it surprises me. It is such a complete, such a perfectly distilled expression of everything that had been done to me. Of the thinking underneath every comparison, every concluded verdict. Why should a woman, after everything, after every year of being the struggling one, the useless one, after Caltech, after building a company from nothing, after making the Forbes 30 under 30 list, why should a woman, the same boy who had laughed in that classroom, the same person who had accepted everything handed to him and destroyed it without a moment of reflection. He stood in front of my desk. And I looked at him. It was not the triumph I had imagined at 14. At 14, I had imagined moments like this as something hot, something electric, something that would feel like winning. It was quieter than that. Stiller. It was the feeling of someone who has already done the work. Looking at the last unresolved piece of a very long equation. And seeing, clearly, what needed to happen next. I looked at him. Long enough for the silence to mean something. Long enough for him to feel the particular quality of being looked at by someone who is completely, entirely, permanently unafraid of you. And I said, "You're fired." Not with anger. Not with the heat of revenge. Not with triumph. Just clearly. Directly. The way you state something that is simply true. The way you say, the sky is blue, the floor is hard, this is over. You're fired. 2 words. The cleanest sentence I had spoken in 30 years. He needed to learn, for the first time in his life, what it meant to actually earn something. What it felt like to be accountable for what you were given. What it required to walk into a room and deserve to be there. That lesson was not mine to teach him. That work belonged to my parents. Not mine. My work was already done. Has justice ever shown up in your life, maybe not how you planned, but in a way that felt like the universe finally paid attention? Tell me below. People always ask me if I got justice. I understand why they ask. The shape of this story invites that question. It has the architecture of a revenge arc. The underdog who was written off, who was handed nothing. Rising. And the people who dismissed her. Falling. But here is my honest answer. The honest answer I have arrived at over years. The justice I got was not what I imagined at 14. At 14, I imagined justice as a moment. One moment. Where the full weight of what they had done landed on them all at once. Where I finally won. That is what 14 imagines justice looks like. A moment. A before and after separated by a single breath. What I actually got was something quieter and more permanent. A moment ends. A moment is over as soon as it has happened. And then you are left standing in the aftermath, wondering why it didn't feel like you thought it would. What I got does not end. It simply is. Every day. Permanently. As a fact rather than a memory. I got to sit in the chair they gave him. Not metaphorically. The actual, physical chair at the head of the actual, physical table in the actual, physical company my parents had built. The company that was never meant for me. The one my father had been discussing on that phone call when I was 7 years old on the floor. I got to sign the documents they never thought I'd sign. Every document that bore my name was a fact. A permanent, unalterable, irrevocable fact about who held the power and who had built something real. I got to decide who stayed and who left, including the brother they had chosen over me. And it did not feel like revenge. It felt like responsibility. The responsibility of someone who is now accountable for something real. I got to give them jobs. My parents. The people who had handed me off without hesitation. Who had put the test down without a word. Who had said a name on a phone call and it wasn't mine. I got to give them jobs. Which meant the useless daughter became the one who held everything together when the smart son destroyed it. I need you to sit with that. Not with triumph. With the full, honest, human weight of it. The useless daughter became the one who held everything together. That is not a moment. That is an architecture. A permanent reshaping of what is true. A new foundation laid over the old one. Not erasing it, not pretending it wasn't there. But changing, completely and permanently, what the structure now stands on. Every day that I sign a document. Every day that I walk through those doors. The architecture holds. Quietly. Without announcement. Without needing to be acknowledged by anyone to be completely, entirely, permanently true. And then there was Uncle Mike. I have been building toward this for the entire story. My parents gave the family company to the wrong child. I say that without anger now. They looked at two children, one who fit the picture they had in their heads, one who didn't. And they chose the picture. But the universe gave the better father to the right one. The greatest justice was never the CEO title. I need to say that clearly. Because I know that is what looks like justice from the outside. The Forbes list, the shares, the chair, the documents, the power. Those are the things that make people say, "She won." But they are not the greatest justice. They are the evidence of it. The residue of it. The greatest justice was that while my brother was inheriting a company, I was being given something that no inheritance can provide. Something that cannot be handed down. A person. One person. Who looked at me. At all of me. And said, "You belong in those high rooms." Before I had any evidence that it was true. Before Caltech. Before the company. Before Forbes. He said it. Without evidence. On faith. That belief. That single, freely given, completely unearned belief became the foundation of everything. Not the laptop. not Caltech. Not the Forbes list or the company or the chair. The belief. And no verdict, no label, no comparison, no test put down without a word can touch that. Not anymore. Not ever again. The foundation holds. Quietly. Permanently. Because that is what foundations do. Forgiveness came eventually. I want to say that honestly and without the kind of tidy, inspirational packaging that makes it sound easier than it actually was. Forgiveness came. But slowly. Unevenly. In the way that real things come, not all at once, not in a single moment of grace where everything that was broken suddenly becomes whole. But in pieces. Small pieces, arriving at irregular intervals, sometimes when you expect them and more often when you don't. It is a practice. Something I return to. Repeatedly. By choice. On the days when the old wound makes itself known again. When something small and ordinary triggers a memory I thought I was finished with. I return to the practice. Not because I have to. Because I have decided to. And I need to be clear about what forgiveness means and what it does not mean. Forgiveness did not mean what happened was acceptable. It was not acceptable. A child should not grow up invisible in her own home. A child should not be handed off without hesitation because she is easier to transfer than to invest in. It did not mean the years I spent feeling worthless were neutralized by the years that followed. The years I spent feeling worthless happened. They are real. They are part of the architecture of who I am. What forgiveness meant was release. The deliberate choice, made repeatedly, by effort, on purpose. To stop letting their verdict live rent-free in my chest. To stop giving free accommodation to a conclusion that was always wrong. Because here is the thing about other people's verdicts. They cannot survive inside you without your participation. They need you to maintain them. I stopped participating. Not all at once. But I stopped. Because the woman who survived years of being labeled the useless one, who built her own company from nothing, who became the CEO, who made the Forbes 30 under 30 list. She does not need their revised opinion to know who she is. She knew before they revised it. That is the part one needs you to hear. She knew. Not because the evidence was already there, but because Uncle Mike had told her. Because one person had looked at her, at all of her, and had said, "You belong in those high rooms." And she had chosen, slowly, unevenly, through practice, to believe him instead of them. That is the real victory. Not the chair. Not the title. The real victory was the moment she chose whose verdict to live by. And chose her own. I want to say one more thing. Directly. To you. The person listening to this right now. If you are listening and you recognize yourself in that 14-year-old in the corner of the room. If you know what it feels like to cry that deeply, that privately, in a place where no one thinks to come and find you. If you have sat with that question, how am I going to survive in a world that has already decided what I am? I am talking to you now. If you have been labeled, concluded upon, handed a verdict by people who looked at one part of you and decided that part was the whole story. If you have been written off by the people who should have been your first believers. I am saying this and I need you to hear it. You do not need their revision to begin. You do not have to wait for the apology, the phone call, the smaller voice, the tears at a kitchen table. You do not have to wait for them to see you before you start building something real. You need one Uncle Mike. One person. Just one. Who looks past the label? Who looks past the diagnosis, the poor grades, the slow handwriting, the way you don't fit the picture? Who looks past all of it to the person underneath? To what is actually there? One person who says, "You belong in those high rooms," before there is any evidence that it is true. And if you do not have that person yet, let this be that voice. For this moment, let me be the person who says it to you before the evidence arrives. You were never what they concluded you were. Never. Not on the day they concluded it. Not through every year they maintained it. You were never that. You also belong in those high rooms. Not one day. Already. As you are. With the label. With the struggle. With the years of being invisible. You also belong. The backspace key exists for a reason. Every mistake is correctable. Every lie that was ever pressed into you by a person who should have known better. Every verdict that was wrong from the day it was reached can be deleted. Use it. Use it on every lie they ever told you about yourself. Delete them. One by one. As many times as it takes. Until what remains is the truth. The truth that was always there, underneath all of it. You are that truth. You were always that truth. And no verdict. No matter how early it was reached, no matter how many people maintained it, no matter how long you believed it, can change that. I sat with that Forbes notification for a long time that morning. The phone still in my hand. The messages still coming in. I wasn't thinking about the recognition. I wasn't thinking about what people would say. I was thinking about her. That 14-year-old girl. Sitting in the corner of a room that didn't know she was breaking. Asking the only question she had left. How am I going to survive in a world that has already decided what I am? I wish I could have walked back into that room. Sat down beside her on the floor. And told her the one thing I know now that I didn't know then. The best revenge is not what you do to them. The best revenge is finally believing in yourself. The way they never did. The way you always deserved to. Because the moment you stop living inside their verdict, the moment you choose to believe the voice that says you belong in those high rooms, over every voice that told you otherwise, that is the moment they lose. Not when you fire the brother. Not when you buy the company. Not when the Forbes list puts your name where they never imagined it. The moment you believed in yourself. That was when it was over. That was when you won. She was going to do more than survive. She was going to sign the checks. And she was going to know, finally, completely, permanently know, that she had been worth believing in. The whole time. And that is where this story ends. Not with a moment. With a decision. The decision to finally believe. Quietly. Permanently. Every single day. If this story meant something to you, if somewhere in this hour you recognized a feeling you know, a weight you have carried, a corner of a room you have sat in, please hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second. And what it does is it tells me this work is landing somewhere real, in someone real. If that is you, 1 second. That is all I am asking. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Because I bring you stories like this every single week. Not occasionally. Every week. Stories about people who were written off. labeled, concluded upon, and who rose anyway. Not because rising is easy, but because somewhere along the way, they made the same decision Amelia made. They chose whose verdict to live by, and chose their own. Those are the stories I tell. Every week. Subscribe, stay, and drop a comment. Right now, while the feeling is still fresh. Tell me, what part of this story landed hardest for you? Was it the dinner table? The test with the 68 put down without a word? The brother who laughed? The parents who handed her off without hesitation? And what that lack of hesitation revealed about how little they had been carrying her at all? Was it Uncle Mike? The man who was not obligated to stop? Who stopped anyway? Was it the Forbes list? The silence in the kitchen that lasted almost a full minute? The smaller voice on the phone? Was it the 2 words? Delivered clearly. The way you state a fact. What did it remind you of? What weight did it name that you have been carrying without a name for it? Tell me. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And they matter. You matter. The story you are living, the one that may not have its Forbes moment yet. That story matters. Drop it below. I will be there. See you next week.